In 1814, 40-year-old Edward Wakefield, a Quaker philanthropist and a statistician from London, was preparing himself to visit the Bedlam Royal Hospital. The visit was the result of months of campaigning from Edward, who, as part of his philanthropic work, had started to visit asylums throughout England. As soon as he entered the institution, better known as Bedlam, it became clear why the governors were so eager to keep out prying eyes. What he saw inside the walls of this now infamous psychiatric hospital would link Edward's life with two other men. One, a leading mind on the treatment of mental health in the Middle Ages, and the other, the long-suffering byproduct of those twisted theories. Edward's visit would stay with him for life, but would begin the start of a major revolution in the treatment of the mentally unwell in Victorian-era England. This story does not have many images to go along with it, as it is so old, but I will do my best to give you as much a visual reference as I can. Finally, when I quote people, it is said in oldie-worldy English, and I kept it this way as I felt it was important to say it as they said it. Thank you for watching, and please drop the video a like as it really helps. Edward was the eldest son of Edward and his wife, Priscilla Bell, who advocated for social initiatives benefiting women and children, including schools and maternity hospitals. She was an author of a range of diverse topics, such as feminist economics and botany, and was well known for her moral guidance and instructional writings for children. It's fair to say Edward was quite influenced by his mother, and went on to become a huge supporter of progressive educational theories. He had also spent a lot of time as a farmer, and was an authority on agricultural practices. By 1814, he was a land agent and a surveyor in London, and had developed an interest into reforming mental asylums. It was this work that drew his attention to the Bedlam Royal Hospital. Bedlam had first been established hundreds of years prior, in 1247, by the Priory of the New Order of Our Lady of Bethlehem, and was originally intended as a centre for the collection of alms, to support the Crusader Church and to link England to the Holy Land. It was set up as a place for the poor and needy, for people who had nowhere else to go. It also provided hospitality to the bishop, canon and brothers of Bethlehem who visited. It eventually became a hospital in the medieval sense, defined as an institution supported by charity or taxes for the care of the needy. By the 14th century, it specialised in caring for those who weren't just poor, but unable to care for themselves, and therefore considered mad. Originally located near Bishopgate, just outside of the walls of the City of London, it later moved to Moorfields in 1676, which was the location at the time of Edward's visit. The Moorfields site was grand and opulent. One architectural journalist referred to it as a palace for lunatics. However, like a metaphor for the institution itself, while it may have looked esteemed and put together from the outside, the building itself was falling apart within years of its establishment due to poor foundations. When it would rain, water would cascade down the walls on the inside, which would creak and collapse in parts. Bedlam was already of cultural significance in Britain by the 1800s, capturing the grim curiosity of the nation, and featuring in Shakespeare's Hamlet and Macbeth. The word Bedlam, as it still does today, had already come to signify a scene of chaos and confusion. Until the late 1700s, visitors to London were actually allowed to come into the asylum itself to to peek at the inhabitants and wonder at the workings of their troubled minds. In fact, the hospital was second only to St Paul's Cathedral as London's top attraction, and was earning around £450 a year in ticket sales, the modern day equivalent of about £113,000. A favourite pastime of a visitor to Bedlam would be to jeer through the bars and goad the patients into acting bizarrely. In 1780, the asylum was so overcrowded with visitors, prostitutes, pickpocketers and food vendors that the governor at the time had no choice but to restrict visitors. By the time Edward was planning his visit, the door had been firmly closed to the public. Attitudes had changed over the course of the late 1700s. Bedlam could only accommodate 120 patients and had a long waiting list, which had encouraged private hospitals to pop up all over London. With these new private institutions came a new school of thought. William Batty of St Luke's Hospital publicly denounced the use of bleeding, blisters, caustics, opium, cold baths and vomits in favour of patients being removed from all objects that are known to cause their disorder. Bedlam physicians disagreed, instead preferring the more traditional methods of medicine, which believed that a disease of the mind was due to a sickness in the body. In classic Greece, Hippocrates had suggested the theory of the four body humours: black bile, yellow bile, blood and phlegm, representing the different aspects of a person and linked to the elements and seasons. Physical and mental health were also connected to these humours. According to Hippocrates, black bile to melancholy, yellow bile to being fiery, blood to being upbeat, and phlegm to being calm. Too much black bile meant feeling sad, and excess of blood or yellow bile could make a person energetic or agitated. To be mentally well, it was believed one needed a balance of these humours. 2,000 years later, this was still considered the best way to treat mental health. Bedlam would take this theory to the next level, inducing vomiting and diarrhea continually, sometimes to the point of death. Doctors would also blister the skin with caustic substances and repeatedly bleed patients. In response to the criticism of these techniques, Dr. James Monroe, the Bedlam physician at the time of Edward's visit, would say that the most adequate and constant cure is by evacuation, and that he never saw or heard of a bad effect of vomits. Another form of treatment frequently used in the 1700s mental health care was hydrotherapy, otherwise known as the bath of surprise. This involved dunking patients into ice-cold water repeatedly. Patients were also subjected to continuous cold water baths, performed with the patient strapped to the tub for hours or even days. Confinement, however, was the main means with which apothecaries, or mad doctors as they were known, would treat cases where people were deemed to be a risk to themselves or others. Restraints such as straitjackets, chains and cages were utilised. This cruel practice involved confining the patient within a tight and confined cage, which they would remain locked in for hours until sedation took effect. Once calmer, they would be released from the cage. Another brutal form of treatment used at Bedlam was rotational therapy. This was a method introduced by Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, in which a patient would be placed in a chair, suspended from a beam by ropes attached to its legs. The chair would then be rotated 20 to 40 times in one direction and allowed to return to its original position. The therapy was believed to be effective in aiding the evacuation of bowels, bladder and the stomach. It was also used as a punishment for particularly difficult patients. John Haslam was the main mad doctor of Bedlam at the time of Edward's visit, and the first of the two men who Edward encountered who would shape the future of Bedlam. A celebrated physician and apothecary, he was born and raised in London, attending university in Edinburgh, and was a well-respected authority on mental health. He had published several major works, including Observations of Insanity, with practical remarks on the disease, and an account of the morbid appearances on dissection, where he would discuss the cases he observed in Bedlam and go into detail about the state of the patient's brain after death. In one example, he writes, "I remember a patient who conceived that, although dead men told no tales, their feeling was very acute. This assumed principle he extended to inferior animals and refused to eat meat because he could not endure to be nourished at the expense of the cruel sufferings which beefsteaks necessarily underwent in cookery." Haslam had already come under fire for his unwillingness to release patients who others would have diagnosed as being cured. One such man, Tilly Matthews, had been deemed sane by second opinions after being held under section by Haslam for a number of years. His defense of this position can be seen in an example he shares in Observations of Insanity. A young man had become insane from habitual intoxication, and during the violence he had attempted to destroy himself. He had amputated his penis with a view of precluding any further insinuations of that nature. For many months after he was admitted into the hospital, he continued in a state which obliged him to be strictly confined. He was constantly medicated, as he constantly meditated his own destruction. On a sudden, he became apparently well, was highly sensible of the delusion under which he had laboured, and conversed as any other person upon the ordinary topics of discourse. There was, however, something in the reserve of his manner, a peculiar look, which persuaded me that he was not well, although no incoherence of ideas could be detected in his conversation. I had observed him for some days to walk rather lame, and once or twice had noticed him sitting with his shoes off, rubbing his feet. On inquiring into the motives of his doing so, he replied that his feet were blistered and wished that some remedy might be applied. When I requested to look at his feet, he declined it, saying they were only tender and uncomfortable. A few days afterwards, he assured me they were perfectly well. The next evening, I observed him, still rubbing his feet. I asked again to examine them. He now told me, with some embarrassment, that he wished much for a confidential friend to whom he might impart a secret of importance. Upon assuring him that he might trust me, he said that the board on which he walked, the second story, were heated by subterraneous fires and under the direction of invisible and malicious agents, whose intentions, he was well convinced, were to consume him by degrees. Haslam had used this to argue that people could often appear to be sane, but in actual fact were still dangers to society in need of treatment. Haslam greatly believed that people were either curable or incurable, and that people who were incurable were a danger to society and would need to be secured for the rest of their lives. One such individual who Haslam deemed incurable was William Norris, and it would be the treatment of Norris, as observed by Edward, which would result in Haslam's downfall. On Edward's visit to Bedlam, he encountered the true horrors within. that had been hidden by Haslam, Monroe and the governors for a number of years, and immediately highlighted the poor conditions to the government, who launched a commission to investigate. And they started exploring the women's galleries, where they found patients restrained in appalling conditions, often naked and covered only by a scant blanket gown that stripped them of their dignity and subjected them to extreme suffering. Many of the patients were chained, specifically by one arm or leg, to the walls of the gallery. The chains were so restrictive that they only allowed the patients to either stand by the wall or sit down on a bench. This meant that they had limited mobility and were denied basic comforts. Patients were unable to move freely or attend to their personal needs, leading to a lack of hygiene and further deterioration of their mental and physical well-being. In his testimony to the committee to make these so-called madhouses in England a better place, Edwards said, "One female in this side room, thus chained, was an object remarkably striking. She mentioned her maiden and married names and stated that she had been a teacher of languages. The keepers described her as a very accomplished lady, mistress of many languages, and corroborated her account of herself. The committee can hardly imagine a human being in a more degraded and brutalizing situation than that in which I found this female, who held a coherent conversation with us, and was of course fully sensible of the mental and bodily condition of those wretched beings, who, equally without clothing, were closely chained to the same wall with herself." The stark contrast between her past and current circumstances struck Edward as a tragic juxtaposition and emphasised the extent of her degradation and the disastrous consequences of confinement within the Bedlam hospital. In the men's wing, patients were found chained close to the walls, handcuffed and locked to the walls by various means, with the ward described as resembling a dog kennel rather than a space for human care. Fights would frequently break out between the patients, with keepers having to physically restrain them. Edwards said, "In the men's wing, there were about 75 or 76 patients, with 2 keepers and an assistant, and about the same number of patients on the women's side. The patients were in no way distinguished from each other as to disease, than as those who were not walking about or chained in the side rooms, and they were lying stark naked upon straw on their bedsteads, each in a separate cell with a single blanket or rug, in which the patient usually lay huddled up, as if impatient of cold, and generally chained to the bedplace in the shape of the trough. About 1/5 were in this state, or chained in the side rooms." In one of the cells on the lower floor, Edward encountered William Norris. He told Edward that he was 55 years old and had been confined for about 14 years. He explained he had been chained as a result of trying to protect himself from what he believed was mistreatment by his keeper. They had restrained him with a long chain passing through a wall partition, allowing the keeper in the neighbouring cell to pull him close to the wall whenever he wanted. To prevent this, Norris wrapped the chain with straw to stop it passing through the wall. Subsequently, he was confined in the way that Edwards saw, with a sturdy iron ring fastened around his neck, connected to a short chain that could slide up or down on a tall iron bar embedded in the wall. There was a wide iron bar about 2 inches in width encircling his midsection. Circular extensions on each side of this bar enclosed his arms, holding them firmly against his body. 2 additional bars, both in front and behind, secured the waist bar. The iron ring around his neck was linked to the bars on his shoulder with a double link, severely restricting his comfort and freedom. Edward learned that he could prop himself up against the wall using the pillow on his bed. However, due to the short length of his chains, only 12 inches long, he couldn't move away from the wall where the iron bar was affixed. He couldn't lie on his side either, because of the protruding parts of the waist bar that confined his arms. His right leg was chained to the trough. This had been his condition for over 12 years. To illustrate the unnecessary restraint he endured, Norris informed Edward that he had managed to free his arms from the manacles that restrained them for some years. He demonstrated by freeing one of them, explaining that when his arms were outside of the restraints, he had to rest them on the edges of the circular extensions, which was more uncomfortable than keeping them within. He spent most of his time lying down, finding it inconvenient to rise and stand up. He spent his days reading various books, including history and newspapers, and engaged in coherent conversations about current events, particularly the ongoing war, in which he had a keen interest. Whenever Edward saw him, he spoke calmly and gave thoughtful and rational responses to his inquiries. The keepers confirmed the entry of his account regarding William Norris. William Norris, who has also been named as James Norris, originally an American sailor, then a Bedlam captive, went on to become a symbol for the urgent need for reformation in mental health facilities. A cartoon of him drawn up for the commission to showcase the complicated restraints he had been forced to live with for 12 years and provoked considerable hostility towards Bedlam and its staff. William's release was demanded and granted immediately, sadly just a few weeks after release due to pneumonia. It wasn't just the practice that had come under question, but the running of the establishment as well. Rumours were rife that staff members were frequently drunk, doctors were often absent, and male staff members were behaving inappropriately with vulnerable female patients. There was also accusations of serious mismanagement of money. The commission set out to investigate all claims and concluded that serious charges were required in order to improve conditions. As a result of the commission's findings, Asylum was removed from Bedlam, as was Dr. Munro, and the whole hospital was moved from the decrepit Moorfields to St. George's Fields. A new medical team was installed, and an 1818 report found patients clean, amply supplied with wholesome provisions, and well clothed, with none under restraint. Mental health treatment would have a long way to go, but there's no doubt that Edward Wakefield's trip to Bedlam had a huge and significant impact on the quality of life for the poor souls who found themselves declared insane in Victorian London. That's the end of this story. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay sane.